September 1557. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful man in the world, sat in his palace surrounded by gold from the Americas. His empire stretched across 4 continents. Spanish ships controlled the oceans. Spanish soldiers dominated Europe. The sun never set on Spanish territory. And yet, Philip II was bankrupt. Completely, utterly broke. He couldn't pay his soldiers. He couldn't service his debts. The richest empire in human history had run out of money. How is that even possible? This wasn't the first time Spain went bankrupt. It was the 4th, and it wouldn't be the last. Between 1557 and 1696, Spain declared bankruptcy 13 times. 13 sovereign defaults in 139 years. No other empire in history has matched this record of financial catastrophe. Spain controlled 80% of the world's precious metals. Gold and silver poured into Spanish ports by the ton. They had more wealth than any nation had ever possessed, yet they still went broke. This is the story of how financial mismanagement destroyed the greatest empire on earth. How debt, inflation, and incompetence turned unlimited resources into national collapse. The lessons from Spain's fall are more relevant today than ever, because the same mistakes that destroyed Spain are being repeated right now by modern governments. The same patterns, same delusions, same inevitable disaster. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, claiming the New World for Spain. What followed was the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. Spanish conquistadors discovered gold in the Caribbean, silver mountains in Peru and Mexico. They stripped entire civilizations of their treasures and shipped it back to Spain. By 1550, Spain controlled the Potosi silver mine in modern-day Bolivia. This single mine produced more silver than the rest of the world combined. Every year, treasure fleets called the Flota de Indias sailed from the Americas loaded with gold and silver. Between 1503 and 1660, Spain imported 16 million kilograms of silver and 185,000 kilograms of gold. To put that in perspective, that's enough wealth to buy every business in Europe multiple times over. It was more money than any civilization had seen in human history. Spain should have become the richest nation on earth for centuries. Instead, they went bankrupt within decades. The first warning signs appeared almost immediately. As gold and silver flooded into Spain, something strange happened. Prices started rising. A loaf of bread that cost 10 maravedis in 1500 cost 30 maravedis by 1550. Rents tripled. Wages needed to keep up, so they doubled. Everything became more expensive. This was Spain's first encounter with inflation on a massive scale. The Spanish didn't understand what was happening. They thought they were getting richer. More gold meant more wealth. Right? Wrong. More money without more goods just means higher prices. The gold and silver weren't making Spain wealthy. They were destroying the currency's value. But inflation was only the beginning of Spain's problems. The real disaster was how they spent the money. King Charles I and his son Philip II were engaged in constant warfare, fighting the French, fighting the Ottomans, defending Catholicism across Europe, crushing Protestant rebellions in the Netherlands, sending the Armada against England. War is expensive, and Spain fought everyone, everywhere, all at once. A single military campaign in Flanders cost more than an entire year's worth of silver shipments from the Americas. The Army of Flanders, Spain's main military force, required 50,000 soldiers paid monthly. In 1572 it cost 1.5 million ducats just to pay the troops. Spain's annual revenue from the Americas was barely 2 million ducats to make up the difference. Spanish kings borrowed heavily. They took loans from German and Italian bankers, the Fuggers of Augsburg, the Genoese banking houses. These bankers lent at interest rates between 12% and 50%. Yes, 50% annual interest. Loan shark territory. But Spain had no choice. They needed money now to pay soldiers. Without pay, soldiers mutinied, and unpaid Spanish soldiers were terrifying. Here's where it gets insane. Spain would borrow money at 40% interest, knowing they couldn't possibly repay it. They promised future silver shipments as collateral, but future silver was already promised to previous creditors. Spain was running a pyramid scheme, borrowing from new lenders to pay old lenders. As long as the silver kept flowing, they could juggle the debts. But the system was mathematically unsustainable. By 1557, Philip II had inherited his father's empire and his father's debts. The numbers were catastrophic. Spain owed 36 million ducats. Annual revenue was only 5 million ducats. Interest payments alone consumed 68% of all income. Philip was paying interest on debt, with more debt. The entire system was collapsing. Philip tried everything to avoid default. He raised taxes. He debased the currency, mixing cheap copper with silver coins. He seized private shipments of gold arriving from the Americas. Nothing worked. The debt was simply too large. On September 1st, 1557, Philip II made an announcement that shocked Europe. Spain was suspending all debt payments. A total default. Creditors would not be paid. Instead, their loans would be converted into juros government bonds paying 5% interest. If you had lent Spain money at 40% interest, too bad. Now you own a bond paying 5%. Take it or get nothing. The Genoese bankers were devastated. They had lent millions expecting huge returns. Instead, they got worthless paper. Some banks collapsed entirely. International credit markets froze. No one would lend to Spain anymore. Without credit, Spain couldn't pay its armies. Without pay, the armies mutinied. The Spanish army of Flanders, unpaid and furious, turned on the civilian population. In 1576, they sacked Antwerp, one of the richest cities in Europe. For 3 days, Spanish soldiers looted, murdered, and burned. 8,000 civilians died. The Spanish fury destroyed Spain's reputation and turned the Netherlands permanently against Spanish rule. But Philip had no choice. The empire was mathematically bankrupt. You can't pay debts that exceed your income indefinitely. Eventually, reality catches up. The 1557 bankruptcy was Spain's admission that infinite borrowing doesn't work. But did they learn the lesson? Not even close. After the 1557 bankruptcy, you'd think Spain would reform. Cut military spending. Stop borrowing. Focus on developing industry and trade. They did the opposite. Within a decade, Spain was borrowing again, fighting again, spending again, and heading toward another bankruptcy. The pattern was always the same. War breaks out. Spain borrows to finance it. Silver shipments arrive, but not enough to cover both debt payments and new military expenses. Spain borrows more. Interest compounds. Debt grows. Eventually, debt payments consume all revenue. Spain defaults. Creditors lose money. Spain promises reforms. Then the cycle starts again. In 1575, Spain declared bankruptcy again. Just 18 years after the first default. Philip II had borrowed 14 million ducats since 1557. He couldn't pay. Another conversion to juros, another wave of banking collapses in Genoa, another period where no one would lend to Spain. In 1596, Philip II declared bankruptcy for the third time. His son, Philip III, declared bankruptcy in 1607 and again in 1627. His grandson, Philip IV, declared bankruptcy in 1647 and 1653. The pattern was unbreakable. Borrow, spend, default, repeat. 13 bankruptcies across 5 kings. But here's the truly insane part. Bankers kept lending to them. After every default, after every haircut on their loans, bankers would lend to Spain again. Why? Because Spain had collateral. Those silver fleets from the Americas. As long as those ships kept coming, there was hope of repayment. And the interest rates were so high that even with defaults, bankers could make money if some loans were repaid. This created a perverse incentive structure. Spain could always find someone willing to lend, so they never had to reform. Bankers could charge extortionate rates, so defaults weren't fatal to them. The system encouraged reckless borrowing and reckless lending. Both sides were trapped in a toxic cycle neither could escape. Meanwhile, the Spanish economy was dying. All that gold and silver flowing through Spain wasn't staying in Spain. It went directly to foreign creditors. Spanish merchants couldn't compete with cheaper foreign goods. Why manufacture cloth in Spain when you could import it from England for less? The gold and silver Spain worked so hard to extract from the Americas flowed straight through Spanish hands into the rest of Europe. Spain became a middleman in their own wealth extraction. They conquered the Americas, they mined the silver. They shipped it home. Then they immediately sent it to Genoa, Augsburg, and Amsterdam to pay debts and buy imports. Spain was a conduit, not a destination. The wealth that should have built Spanish industry instead built everyone else's. How does a nation with unlimited precious metals go bankrupt? It seems impossible, but Spain proved it can happen. In fact, the gold and silver made the problem worse. This is one of history's greatest economic paradoxes. First, the treasure caused massive inflation. From 1500 to 1600, prices in Spain increased by 400%. A loaf of bread costs 4 times more. Rent costs 4 times more. Everything costs more. But wages didn't keep up. Workers got poorer in real terms, even as gold piled up in the treasury. This is called the price revolution, and it devastated the Spanish working class. Second, the treasure destroyed Spanish industry. Why build factories when you can buy everything with gold? Spanish nobles imported luxury goods from France, England, and the Netherlands. They bought silk from China, spices from India, manufactured goods from everywhere else. Spanish craftsmen couldn't compete with cheap imports. Manufacturing collapsed. Spain became dependent on foreign production. Third, the treasure created a lazy aristocracy. Spanish nobles didn't need to be productive. They could live on rents and government positions. Hard work was for peasants. Commerce was for Jews and foreigners. A Spanish gentleman fought, prayed, or administered, but he did not labor. This cultural attitude crippled Spanish economic development. Fourth, the treasure enabled military advance. Without the Americas, Spain couldn't afford constant warfare. The silver made wars seem affordable, but they weren't. Spain spent more on war than they earned from the Americas. The treasure didn't fund the empire. It enabled debt that funded the empire. Big difference. The economist Adam Smith later called this the Spanish delusion, the belief that gold equals wealth. It doesn't. Wealth is productive capacity. Factories, farms, skilled workers, technology, trade networks. Gold is just a medium of exchange. Spain had infinite gold but declining productive capacity. They were getting poorer while holding more precious metals. The ultimate economic irony. Meanwhile, Spain's enemies understood this. The Dutch kicked out of Spanish rule, built a commercial empire. They manufactured goods, developed financial instruments, created stock markets and insurance. England did the same. They built industries, developed trade networks, invested in naval power for commerce, not just war. Both nations ended up wealthier than Spain, despite having no silver mines. The difference was philosophy. Spain extracted wealth from the earth. England and Holland created wealth through production and trade. Spain thought wealth was a fixed pie to be seized. England and Holland knew wealth was something you create. By 1700, both nations had surpassed Spain economically despite Spain's continued access to American silver. Bankruptcy doesn't just hurt your credit rating, it destroys your military power. And for Spain, military power was everything. The empire was held together by Spanish soldiers. The moment Spain couldn't pay those soldiers, the empire began to crumble. Unpaid soldiers are worse than no soldiers. A paid army fights for you, an unpaid army fights for themselves. Spanish troops mutinied regularly when pay was delayed. These weren't small protests. These were full military mutinies, where soldiers would elect their own leaders, refuse orders, and loot civilian populations until they were paid. The Spanish army of Flanders mutinied 45 times between 1572 and 1607, 45 separate rebellions by Spain's own troops. Each time, Spain had to negotiate with its own army, often paying them more than originally owed, just to restore order. These mutinies destroyed Spain's military effectiveness and terrorized the populations Spain was trying to control. The most infamous mutiny was the sack of Antwerp in 1576. Spanish soldiers, unpaid for months, attacked one of Europe's richest cities. The Spanish Fury, as it became known, killed 8,000 civilians and destroyed a third of the city. The atrocity turned the entire Netherlands against Spain permanently. What Spain's enemies couldn't accomplish through war, Spain's bankruptcy accomplished for them. Military commanders knew they couldn't rely on timely payment, so they stopped taking risks. Why launch an aggressive campaign when your troops might mutiny halfway through? Spanish generals became cautious, defensive, reactive. Meanwhile, English and Dutch commanders, backed by more reliable financing, could plan long-term strategies. Financial instability created military mediocrity. Spain's navy suffered the same fate. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was supposed to invade England and crush Protestant rebellion. It was the largest naval invasion force ever assembled, but it was also financed on credit. When the Armada failed and the ships were lost, Spain couldn't afford to rebuild. The loan for the Armada had to be repaid even though the ships were at the bottom of the ocean. After 1588, Spanish naval power declined rapidly. English and Dutch pirates, operating with government backing, raided Spanish treasure fleets with increasing success. In 1628, Dutch Admiral Piet Hein captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet worth 12 million guilders. It was the greatest heist in history. Spain lost a year's worth of American silver in one battle. Without a navy to protect the treasure fleets, the collateral backing Spain's debts was at risk. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War and marked Spain's decline as Europe's dominant power. Spain had fought for 30 years to maintain Catholic supremacy and territorial control. They failed on both counts. The war cost Spain everything, and they had nothing to show for it. The empire that had dominated Europe for a century was now a second-rate power. Bankruptcy had turned military superpower into military has-been. Financial crises doesn't just hurt governments, it destroys entire societies. And Spain's repeated bankruptcies created a cascade of social problems that lasted centuries. First, the inflation destroyed the middle class. Merchants, craftsmen, and small landowners saw their savings evaporate. A family that had saved 1,000 ducats in 1500 found that, by 1600, that money bought one-fourth as much. This entire lifetimes of saving were wiped out by inflation. Second, the tax burden crushed the peasantry. Spain's kings kept raising taxes to pay debts, but nobles and clergy were exempt from most taxes. That meant the entire burden fell on peasants and urban workers. Some regions paid 60% of their income in taxes. People starved while gold flowed through Spain to foreign bankers. Third, economic opportunity disappeared. Young Spaniards had few options. Agriculture was taxed to death. Manufacturing couldn't compete with imports. Trade was controlled by foreigners. The only prospects were the military, the church, or emigration to the Americas. Millions left Spain for the colonies. The homeland was bleeding talent and population. Fourth, corruption became endemic. When the government is broke, officials steal, tax collectors would pocket revenues, military officers would embezzle soldier pay, bureaucrats sold offices to the highest bidder. Everyone was skimming because no one expected the system to survive long-term anyway. Why be honest in a collapsing system? Fifth, a culture of fatalism emerged. The Spanish Golden Age in literature, art, and theater flourished during this period. But Spanish culture became obsessed with honor, death, and decay. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, a satire of Spain's delusions of grandeur. Playwright Calderon wrote about life as a dream, reality as illusion. Spanish art turned dark, featuring skulls, suffering saints, and martyrdom. The culture reflected the dying empire. The population of Spain actually declined in the 17th century. This almost never happens without plague or war. But Spain achieved it through economic collapse. In 1600, Spain had 8.5 million people. By 1700, only 7 million. A nation that controlled the Americas, that imported unlimited treasure, lost population. People were literally fleeing or starving despite the gold flowing through their ports. While Spain collapsed, other nations watched carefully and learned the opposite lessons. The Dutch Republic, having fought free from Spanish rule, did everything differently. They didn't have gold mines. They had banks. They didn't have treasure fleets. They had trade networks. And they built a financial system Spain couldn't comprehend. In 1609, Amsterdam founded the Wissel Bank, one of the first true central banks. It provided stable currency, clearing services for merchants, and reliable credit. Dutch interest rates were 3 to 4%, compared to Spain's 40 to 50%. This meant Dutch merchants could borrow cheaply to finance trade voyages, while Spanish merchants couldn't compete. Financial sophistication beat precious metals. The Dutch also pioneered joint stock companies. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, allowed investors to pool capital and share risks. This mobilized more money for trade than any single merchant could. Spain tried to copy this but failed because Spanish law and culture didn't support corporate structures. Spanish ventures remained individual or royal monopolies. England learned similar lessons. After watching Spain's inflation, England kept tight control over its money supply. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, managed currency carefully. English interest rates stayed low. English merchants could borrow reliably. English industry could invest in expansion. By 1700, England's economy was growing, while Spain's was shrinking. Both nations also learned that industrial production beats resource extraction. You can't build sustainable wealth by digging up silver. You build wealth by making things people want to buy. Dutch manufactured ships, cloth, and ceramics. English manufactured wool, iron, and eventually machinery. Both nations became wealthier than Spain without a single silver mine. The most important lesson was about government finance. You cannot borrow indefinitely. You cannot default repeatedly and maintain credibility. You cannot tax your productive population to death while exempting the wealthy. England and Holland kept taxes reasonable, spread broadly, and paid their debts reliably. Spain did the opposite and paid the price. By 1700, the balance of power had shifted completely. The Anglo-Dutch alliance controlled global trade. Spain was a declining power clinging to its American colonies. The empire that had dominated 1500s Europe was irrelevant by 1700. Financial mismanagement had accomplished what no military enemy could. It had destroyed Spain from within. The 18th century was Spain's slow death spiral. The silver mines of Potosi were depleting. Production peaked in 1650 and declined steadily afterward. By 1700, the mines produced half what they did 50 years earlier. Spain's collateral was running out. The colonies were becoming more trouble than they were worth. Administering a global empire costs money. Protecting it from rivals costs more money. And the revenues from the Americas weren't enough to justify the expense anymore. Spain lost more territory. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 forced Spain to give Gibraltar to England and territory to Austria. These weren't military defeats. These were financial concessions. Spain couldn't afford to keep fighting, so they surrendered land instead. Bankruptcy turned superpowers into beggars. The Spanish Bourbons who took over in 1700 tried reforms. They modernized the tax system. They attempted to develop industry. They invested in infrastructure, but the reforms came too late. Spain had lost a century to financial mismanagement. The Dutch and English had a 100-year head start in building modern economies. Spain couldn't catch up. By 1800, Spain was a minor power. Napoleon Italy invaded in 1808. Spain's American colonies began rebelling in 1810. By 1830, Spain had lost almost all of its American empire. Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Argentina, Chile all independent. The empire that had lasted 300 years dissolved in 20 years? The final cause? Spain couldn't afford to send armies to reclaim the colonies. Bankruptcy meant impotence. By 1900, Spain lost its last significant colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States. The Spanish-American War lasted 10 weeks. Spain's military was so outdated and underfunded they couldn't resist. The empire that once controlled half the world was now a minor European nation with no colonies and no power. For centuries of silver had bought nothing but decline. Here's what makes Spain's story so important. The lessons were obvious. Yet modern governments are repeating the exact same mistakes. Let's compare Spain's empire to modern economies. The parallels are frightening. Lesson 1. You can't borrow forever. Spain borrowed at 40% interest, expecting future silver to cover debts. Modern governments borrow trillions, expecting future GDP growth to cover debts. Spain defaulted 13 times. How many times will modern nations default? The U.S. national debt is $36 trillion and growing. Japan's debt is 264% of GDP. These are Spanish level numbers. Lesson 2. Inflation destroys wealth. Spain's treasure caused 400% inflation that destroyed purchasing power. Modern central banks print trillions, causing asset inflation and consumer price inflation. Your house didn't get better, the money got worse. Spain's inflation made their gold worthless. Modern inflation makes your savings worthless. Same mechanism. Lesson 3. Living beyond your means has consequences. Spain spent more on military adventures than they earned. Modern governments spend more than they collect in taxes. Spain borrowed to make up the difference. Modern governments do the same. Spain eventually couldn't borrow anymore. Modern governments will face the same reckoning. Lesson 4. Resource wealth doesn't equal prosperity. Spain had unlimited silver, but declining living standards. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, but people are starving. Saudi Arabia is rich from oil but has no diversified economy. Russia depends on natural resources but has a weak industrial base. Resource extraction doesn't build lasting wealth. Spain proved that 400 years ago. Lesson 5. Financial credibility matters. After the first bankruptcy, Spain paid higher interest rates. After the fifth bankruptcy, no one trusted them. Modern nations think they can print money forever with no consequences. But eventually, creditors lose faith. When the dollar or euro loses reserve currency status, borrowing costs will explode, just like Spain. Lesson 6. You can't tax your way out of debt. Spain raised taxes repeatedly. It crushed economic growth and made the debt problem worse. Modern governments raise taxes while claiming it will solve deficits. It won't. Spain proved that tax increases without spending cuts just accelerate decline. The productive class leaves or stops producing. Revenue falls even as rates rise. We are living through the beginning of Spain's cycle. The United States borrows trillions annually. The deficit in 2024 was $1.8 trillion. Interest on the national debt costs $1.1 trillion per year. That's more than defense spending, more than Medicare. The U.S. is approaching the point where interest payments consume all revenue. Just like Spain in 1557, the European Union has similar problems. Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio is 145%. Greece's is 172%. France's deficit is 5.5% of GDP. These nations can't grow out of their debt. They can only roll it over, just like Spain rolled over debts from one lender to another. Eventually, the music stops. Japan's debt is 264% of GDP. This is uncharted territory. No modern nation has ever had debt this high without defaulting or hyperinflating. Japan keeps borrowing because they can, interest rates are low, and the Bank of Japan buys government bonds. But this is Spain's logic. Borrow because you can, not because you should. China's local government debt is estimated at $13 trillion. Provinces borrowed to build infrastructure that doesn't generate revenue. Ghost cities, unused highways, bridges to nowhere. This is Spain building palaces with borrowed gold. Impressive construction. Economic disaster. The difference between Spain and now. Spain defaulted. Modern governments will try to inflate. They'll print money to pay debts and devalued currency. This is default by another name. Your government bonds will be repaid, but the money will buy nothing. Your pension will arrive, but it won't cover rent. Spain's creditors lost money through default. Modern creditors will lose money through inflation. Same result, different mechanism, but there's a deeper similarity. Spain's elite never suffered. Nobles kept their land. Clergy kept their wealth. Only peasants paid the price for imperial bankruptcy. Today's elite won't suffer either. They own assets that inflate with money printing. They have access to credit at preferential rates. They can move wealth across borders. The middle class and working poor will pay the price, just like in Spain.